Hello, welcome to Memo Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were uprooted and expelled from their historical homes, and roughly 15,000 were killed by Zionist forces that would go on to form the State of Israel. The Nakba, which in Arabic means the catastrophe, is a key historical memory and trauma for Palestinians. But the war on Palestine did not end in 1948. A number of leading Palestinian intellectuals have made the point that the Nakba is an ongoing process and that the current war in Gaza is an extension of it. However, almost since the Nakba took place, there has been a tendency to deny or minimalize it. Denialism seems to be a key feature of Zionism. If we go back to the early Zionist slogans, including a land for a people without a land. Why is this denialism so prevalent, and how has it evolved? And how are these attempts being resisted? Joining us today is historian Ilan Pappe. Professor Ilan Pappe is director of the European Centre for Palestine Studies and at the University of Exeter. He received his DPhil from the University of Oxford. From 1984 to 2006, Pappe taught at the University of Haifa in Israel, for which he resigned in 2006 after various failed attempts to expel him due to his ideological positions. He moved to the University of Exeter in 2007. Pappe has written over 22 books to date, among them The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine in 2007 and On Palestine with Noam Chomsky in 2010. His most recent book are The 10 Myths of Israel, The Biggest Prison on Earth, A History of Israeli Occupation in 2019, A Historical Dictionary of Palestine with Joseph Mansour in 2021, and Our Vision for Liberation with Ramzy Baroud in 2022. And I believe you've got another one out too, don't you, Professor?
Yes, called Lobbying for Zionism across the Atlantic.
Well,
the history of the Israeli lobby on both Britain and the United States.
Well, that's a good way to thank you for talking to us, Professor Pappe.
It's a pleasure.
So, the Nakba is obviously, a very key event, in the history of Palestine, the history of the Middle East. But we have obviously a tendency, to think about historical episodes as simply that, an event, a thing that took place at one point. But a lot of Palestinian intellectuals have obviously made the point that the Nakba is an ongoing process and that it will continue to go on. It never really ended. It's not simply an event. It is, it is the Palestinian experience of the last 70 years. I wonder if we could start right at the beginning, though, and talk to us what exactly was the Nakba and how does it still impact life today?
Yes, the Nakba was actually an Israeli campaign of ethnic cleansing that began when the British announced the decision to leave Palestine after ruling it for 30 years, between 1918 to 1948. They made the announcement of their decision to leave Palestine at the beginning of 1947. And a few months later, the Zionist leadership began an ethnic cleansing operation, first on a very limited scale because Britain was still responsible for law and order. But even under British rule that continued until May 1948, already the Israeli, call them the Zionist forces because the Israeli army was created after May 1948. So the Zionist forces until May 1948 already expelled 250,000 Palestinians, most of them city dwellers, and thus destroyed about 11 Palestinian towns in the process. The Nakba continued after Israel was established, and despite the fact of some neighboring Arab countries to send forces to try and stop the continuation of the ethnic cleansing, it continued. While the Israeli army was able to repel those contingents that were sent from the Arab world. And until the end of 1948, eventually, Israel destroyed half of Palestine's villages, more than 500, most of its towns, expelled half of Palestine's population, nearly 750,000 people, and erased the villages and built on the ruins either Jewish settlements or planted on them trees and created recreational parks or forests on them. So the Nakba is, first of all, this kind of campaign. But the Nakba is also, I would say, the trauma of a whole nation of people losing their careers, their aspirations, not just their homes and businesses and fields, but their life is cut, their normal life is cut and lost, and they have to start from scratch anywhere else. So I think that's a Nakba 48. We talk about, you asked and rightly, and you mentioned it in your introduction, that Palestinians are saying that this is not a one-off event. And in fact, as scholars, we tend to frame Zionism now as a settler colonial movement. And settler colonial movements, which usually are made of European, like the Jews who had to escape from Europe or wanted to escape from Europe, but landed in someone else's homeland, and usually saw the natives or the indigenous people as an obstacle for their salvation or for the project of building a new homeland instead of the one that didn't want them. And we found out, with the help of scholars who work on this, that actually you have to be aware that settler colonialism or the elimination of the native is not a one-off event. It's actually what we call in history a structure. By that we mean that as long as the ideology of the settler colonialist movement persists, the method of getting rid of the population will be repeated again and again. And more concretely, we know that Israel continued to expel Palestinian villages between 1948 and 1967, expelled 300,000 Palestinians during the June 67 war, the so-called 6 Days War. And since 1967 until today, by various means, more than 600 to 700,000 Palestinians have lost their homes and were expelled from the homeland. And of course, today we're witnessing probably the worst phase of uprooting and ethnic cleansing, a continued Nakba, but probably the worst chapter in this, what we have been now discussing as the ongoing Nakba.
It's interesting because, I mean, one of the big topics we're sort of going to be tackling now is the idea of denialism. And it seems to me just like every aspect of, not just in 1948, but even when we look at Israeli officials, supporters of Israel's actions today, there's always this strong element of denialism, whether it's the denialism of the event taking place or denialism of who holds responsibility for that event. So you would say, I've seen people in the US make the argument, yes, what is happening in Gaza is a tragedy, blame Hamas, even though we're the ones who threw the rocket. So there's a big part of it which is denialism, and this is, I think, going to be where we're going to come on to in a second, because I think it's a very key area and something we should explore further. But I sort of want to pull you up also on this settler colonialism idea, because it's really interesting to me that when we look at settler colonial projects, because I think there's this idea that it's kind of a unique situation in the sense that you have a persecuted people who fled Europe to take over another land, and part of the complication about condemning it is the fact that they were thrown out. But this is not, in fact, as unusual historically, is it? I mean, if we think about the French in Algeria, a lot of the French people who settled in Algeria were from parts of France or even parts of now Germany that were expelled and had nowhere else to go. The American, Pilgrim story as well. So there's a very long process of this kind of thing, isn't there?
Yeah, oh, definitely. Settler colonialism is a global phenomenon. The case of Zionism stands out for various reasons. One, its historical timing. It started when most settler colonial projects, such as the one you have mentioned, were definitely in North America and Australia, were very old by then. And the Algerian one was also nearly coming to an end, So the historical timing was different from the others, and I think that's why it's so difficult to persuade people that there is a settler colonial project. And secondly, the Israeli propaganda, or you can call it narrative, whatever you want to call it, was very successful in creating this idea that if you claim a land in the name of an attachment that is 2,000 years old, you are not a settler colonial movement. I'm here in Doha in a conference, and a State Department official tried to convince us that it's very wrong to call Zionism settler colonialism. And immediately, what did he mention? He said, well, the Jews had this attachment to Palestine and they came from Palestine 2,000 years ago. Of course, if you examine the logic of that argument, it's ridiculous at best and ingenious and at worst. And I think this is, but this was kind of a shield that confused people. When you talk about settler colonialism, they say, yes, but this is not colonization. According to the Zionist narrative, this is return. They're returning back to the ancient homeland. But yes, but I think what is really clear, and I have to say this is now a common perception of most of the scholars working on Palestine, that despite these unique features, it is still a classical case of settler colonialism, and the elimination policies in the North America until now at least were worse because they included genociding the indigenous people. But we are not sure anymore. When we used to say this hasn't happened in Palestine, but I'm not sure we can say that anymore after the events of the last 8 months.
Indeed, indeed. And I think there's an additional component here as well, which is that, and we talk a lot about, Zionism, we tend to think of it through the prism of, let's say, the 19th century and early 20th centuries, where it starts to take up pace among, particularly Jews living in Europe. It's a very distinctly Ashkenazi European Jewish project as well. That's another important aspect. But actually, as an idea, it sort of begins to ferment not among Jews in Europe, but among Christians in Europe. And it sort of begins as a Christian Protestant movement towards it. And I think that adds an additional layer. And because also I think there's something else interesting here, which is if you were to talk to, let's say, I'm in the UK, if you were to talk to people about America, there is a recognition that there is an evangelical aspect to supporting Israel in the US. But it's treated as if it's a uniquely American phenomenon, when historically it's a very European one. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this evangelicalism or this sort of Messianicism within the European context that led to the development of Zionism from Christians.
Yes, this was a particular interest topic to me because, as I said, I just finished this book, Lobbying for Zionism Across the Atlantic, namely focusing not just on the United States, but also in Britain. And it turned out to be a long book. And the reason it was that I found out that you have to have a detailed descriptions of the origins of this Zionist idea of the right of the Jews to colonize Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. And you're absolutely right. It begins with British evangelical kind of gurus in today's words. Very important people in positions of power who genuinely believe that the return of the Jews to Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the beginning of the end of time. And they had a similar following among important Americans who also were part of the evangelical or believed in this evangelical dogma that the 19th century in particular, and whenever they thought they saw the decline of the Ottoman Empire as indication that actually the return of the Jews has to happen now in order for the divine scheme to be fulfilled. And I think what is interesting is that in Britain in particular, there was a kind of a bond between the evangelical aristocrats and the Jewish aristocrats on this question, because British still is, but then definitely was a class society. So it was very important to which class you belonged. And the evangelical Christians in the House of Lords shared the seats with important Jewish families, not to mention one. Famous one is the Rothschild, but not only the Rothschild, the Reddings, the Montagues, the many of them. And what I found so interesting in understanding the origin of Zionism is that it was not just this theological idea that I was talking about. You know, it's important for the Jews to return so that Jesus Christ can come back. No, it was actually quite a knowledgeable group of people who understood exactly the dire situation of the Jews in Russia and certain parts of Eastern Europe. And their biggest fear was that this mass Jewish people would immigrate to England, would bring with them revolutionary ideas, would impose on the British economy. We're familiar with anti-immigration arguments today. They're not that different. And the biggest pro-Zionist politician of all who held the positions of prime minister and then foreign secretary, Arthur Balfour, legislated in 1905 the Alien Act that was meant to prevent specifically poor Jews from coming into Britain. So it's a kind of a mixture of evangelical theology with pure anti-Semitism, shared by very veteran Anglo-Jewish community that also didn't like the idea of poor Jews coming to Britain, and channeling them to Palestine served different interests. It prevented them from coming to Britain, and in the case of evangelical Christians, hopefully also contributed to the end of time. Later, these two groups had to convince, let's say, most secular British policymaker that it was in the imperial British interest, first of all, to make Palestine British, which was not clear for everyone, because Palestine doesn't have that much of strategic value compared to Egypt and Iraq, for instance, which Britain insisted of having, and then convince them that the best way to have a British Palestine is to have a Jewish one. And that was already Islamophobic, claiming that if the Arabs and the majority of Muslims would be running Palestine, it would not serve the British interest. So yes, I think you're right. It's people associated with Christian fundamentalists today in the US, but it was, and you can think about the Palestinians. They were facing this huge alliance. Probably not one person in Palestine knew that already in the mid-19th century, you have these powerful people discussing how to create a Jewish state at their expense, and then later on turning these fluid ideas into a strategy of dispossession. So yeah, I think it's very important to revisit these origins and remember the complicity of course, not all the evangelical Christians. We should be careful here, but certain streams within evangelical Christianity.
Yes, and I think it's also interesting to think that, this was, you had state policies being built around this. So in the UK between up until the 1940s, they don't want Jewish people, immigration coming into the UK, as you mentioned, and they sort of, part of the reason for encouraging settlement in Palestine was not partly obviously for colonization, but partly to make sure they don't come to the UK. It's a way of making sure they don't come here.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask here, though, did other European countries adopt a similar attitude? Did the French, Spanish, Germans do something similar here?
Not so much. It's interesting. The Zionist movement first pinned its hope on the German, Prussian, and then the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But actually, the political elites there were not convinced that a Jewish immigration from the East is a problem. Yes, it's before the rise of Nazism, of course, and fascism. France is a different case. I think France may have subscribed to similar ideas, but in a different way. I saw it in the way that they treated the Jews of Algeria and Morocco, in Tunis. They brought, these Jewish communities always saw themselves as Arabs who happen to be Jews. And there are Arabs who happen to be Muslims, and there are Arabs or North Africans who happen to be Berbers or different kinds of religions. The French brought the idea for anti-Semitic reasons, or from France, that the Jews were actually a different race, as they used to call it then, which meant a different nation, and therefore they're not French. And they're also not Moroccans, and they're also not Tunisian. So they are Jews who happen to be in Morocco, not Moroccans who happen to be Jews. So they are not in their homeland. But that was pure anti-Semitism in their case. Not so much a fear of the Jews coming from Russia, but very old, probably still the old Catholic anti-Semitism that, despite of the secularization of France, remained very inherent part of the way French, especially the French right, looked at the Jews, and was very happy about the idea of Zionism. I mean, there was this unholy alliance. Zionism wanted the Jews of France to come to Palestine, and the anti-Semites in France wanted the Jews of France to go to Palestine. So, and this kind of alliance, you can even see it today, between extreme anti-Semitic groups that defend Israel vehemently today in Europe.
Indeed, and there's always been that sort of connection between Zionism and the idea of Zionism in Palestine and anti-Semitism in Europe. It's a very old alliance, and we look at, Netanyahu going to cozy up with Viktor Orban. There's nothing, historically unusual about any of that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And Israel is going more and more in this direction. I mean, the way Israeli politics go, it's very clear that in the future, its main allies would be urban neo-right parties, supremacist parties or extreme Republicans in the United States, Modi in India. I mean, they will have, whereas they always aspired from the beginning to be part of the social democratic world and wanted connection with what they regarded were civilized nations, they are now building different kinds of alliances, which I think will isolate them further in the world.
Indeed. And I now want to sort of bring us onto the concept of denialism and the role that denialism plays within, first of all, Zionist ideology. And then I want to move forward into how it practically plays out in Israeli politics and society. So if we can sort of start there, what role does denialism play within Zionism itself?
Yeah, definitely. It was very important to deny, first of all, the existence of Palestinians in Palestine. This idea that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for the people without the land, kind of using scholarly works, artistic works, and so on, to portray a desert. And it's incredible that still today, we heard the president of the EU, when she congratulated Israel last year on its Independence Day, talking about Israel blooming the desert as if Palestine was a desert. So that's one form of denial, the denial of the existence of the people. Now, there's another level of denial where you already understand that you cannot deny anymore the existence of the people because they are there. You deny them as people, you deny them as human beings. The dehumanization is always the next step, because they're still there, and actually they contradict your idea of an empty land, and you empty the land again by saying, yes, but they are nomads, they don't have roots in this place, they have 21 other countries, whatever Israel would use to deny the connection of the Palestinians to Palestine, and so on. And then there is the denial of the crimes, which for me is the most important one in many ways, the denial of the Nakba. In fact, I find it, I'm 70 years old, looking back at my own kind of work as an historian, as an activist, I sort of realized that I devoted 50 years exactly against that particular denial of the Nakba. And recently, I was able even to open a charity in Britain called the Nakba Memorial Foundation that is devoted to fight against the Nakba. We hope to create the first ever center against Nakba denial in London. We think it should be in London because Britain is quite complicit. But coming back to this, I think it's for people, it's good to know that we are involved in this because the denial is still there. Especially the denial, it's right that the denial is also on the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba. But I do think that the root of the thing is denying the 48 Nakba, because most of the politicians that have an effect on the reality in Palestine because of their position of power either do not know or ignore or don't want to know what happened in 1948. They really don't understand it. Look, for example, at the American policymakers who were involved in the so-called peace process. Dennis Ross, Martin Indyk, Bill Clinton even, Jimmy Carter. For them, what they call the conflict started in 1967. They have never mentioned 1948 in their discourse, in their analysis. It started when Israel occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and hence peace is the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But that's just a chapter. I mean, what happened in 67 is a small chapter in the history of dispossession. And the most important chapter is 1948, to understand why there is still bloodshed and so on. Another good example, why is it so important to go to 1948? You cannot understand the emotive part of what happened in Gaza on the 7th of October without connecting it to 1948. Israel has persuaded the British government, the American government, the mainstream media in Britain and the United States that what happened on the 7th of October has to do either with Iran, with Islamic jihadism, with new anti-Semitism. It's amazing. They don't even mention the fact that 70% of the people who live in Gaza are 1948 refugees, and that the Gaza Strip was created by Israel as a huge refugee camp on purpose in 1948. It expelled people from Palestine into the Strip, and it created it as a refugee camp. So, and that the settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October were former Palestinian villages, which were the last one to be occupied and destroyed during the Nakba. You cannot decontextualize what's going on today in Palestine, both in terms of the Palestinian resistance and in terms of the Israeli reaction, without going back to 1948, at least to 1948. As you mentioned in your opening remark, probably we should go even back in time. But at least let's take 1948 as a formative year when Israel is a state of denial, in both meaning of the state of denial. You know, it's constantly in a state of denial, but it's also a state that devotes a lot of time and energy to deny. And acknowledgement as an antidote to denial, I think, is a very important first step. It's not the final step, but it's a very important first step for genuine reconciliation and not the artificial peace process that we have been witnessing over the years.
I'm wondering here then, as we sort of talk of denialism, I mean, obviously the Nakba happened in 1948, when it started, or, a lot of people would argue actually started even before that. But we'll focus on 48 for now. A few generations have now passed since then. And I'm sort of wondering about, if we think about Israeli policymakers today, we'll start with policymakers and then we'll go on to society. How much do they actually understand about what actually happened in 48? How much do they really know about the Nakba itself? Because obviously this denialism, it serves a purpose. It's not just to dissuade outsiders that they did nothing wrong. It's not even just to dissuade people in your own country that nothing happened. It's also to persuade yourself and the future selves of yourself, your children, your grandchildren who go into government, that nothing happened. So what is the state of knowledge there?
I think it's very interesting. It has changed over time. I would say until the beginning of the 21st century, the denial was an attempt to conceal what happened. It was a different Israel, one should say. It was an Israel that believed that if people would know what was done in 48, it would undermine Israel's image, and maybe even some people inside the Jewish society would find it difficult to accept. Israel has changed so dramatically in this century, moving to the right, taking over by Messianic Zionist movement and so on, that they actually are having this crazy, paradoxical attitude to the Nakba. It's quite incredible. On the one hand, they have NGOs in the Israeli universities who made sure that nobody talks about the Nakba. And they passed a Nakba law in 2010. According to the Nakba law, it's a violation of the Israeli law to refer to the 1948 events as a Nakba. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, one after the other of these leaders told the people in Gaza, ever since the 7th of October, we're going to inflict of you a new Nakba. So you can see the kind of abuses of the Nakba memory. On the one hand, they say, oh, it's a fabrication. On the other hand, let's remind them of what we did, as if it's only directed to them and the Israeli public doesn't hear it or the world doesn't hear it. But it is this kind of transformation, I think, from maybe, I hope I'm right, a leadership that had some moral inhibitions, some moral understanding. I don't think they regretted what they did, but they felt it was not the best thing to tell about it. We're moving to a political elite now in Israel that thinks that this is absolutely just and moral to pursue such policies, including genocide. And you can hear it in the discourse. That's why the South African delegation to the International Court of Justice had such an easy job, at least to show that the official discourse of politicians in Israel is genocidal. And if it is genocidal, it means that definitely they would have no problem on admitting what was done in 1948. So it's a very weird kind of situation. However, I should just add quickly, the Israeli educational system totally denies the Nakba. The public discourse, whether it comes through newspapers, cultural venues, media, there's no mentioning whatsoever. It's an event that didn't happen, and as I said, in fact, it's a felony to refer to these events as Nakba today in Israel.
Yes, it's kind of interesting because, the Israel of before 2000s was obviously an Israel that wanted to be seen as a liberal society in the Middle East. And there is still this sort of enduring, although fading, romance in the West, particularly that Israel is somehow deep down a liberal place, even though all the evidence is contradictory to that right now. They're still insisting that it is. And it's because it's when you talk about the Nakba law and not allowing to refer to it, it actually makes me think more of Russia, a place like that, where there's certain parts of history you shouldn't talk about. I mean, there's a nice saying in Russia that Russian history begins in 1941. Those who say it began in 1939 are traitors, for referring to the Nazi-Soviet pact.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it sort of mirrors in that way this kind of denialism, which it seems to be, sort of prevalent. And as you're saying as well, in society, people are sort of, through the education system, don't actually learn about it. But you do sort of wonder, because a lot of people must get their story, hear about these sorts of things through their own families. I mean, a lot of the commanders who did the expelling had children, and they had children. So there must be something that trickling down that way, right?
Well, I think what filters is the dehumanization. Namely, you can read the memoirs of an several of them were very popular. You can read the memoirs of Israeli officers who participated in the Nakba. And the way they describe the Palestinian village is the way that they describe it like a military base. And everybody living there was actually the enemy, whether they were babies or grown-up men. And I think that's how the average Israeli reader would read it. Namely, it was not a village, a civilian space that was occupied. Some of the people that were massacred and others were expelled, which is at least a war crime, if not part of a crime against humanity. No, it was a military base, and that was attacking Israel, and Israel retaliated or whatever, and it was occupied, and the enemy was destroyed without any reference to who is the enemy, who was the enemy. So I think dehumanization helps to kind of purify this memory for those who were interested to hear what their parents or grandparents did in 1948. It's interesting, I mean, how people live with it. I did a project many, many years ago with the Israeli director Eyal Sivan, and we interviewed 33 Israeli soldiers who were in their 90s. And they told us that for the first time they will share with us the atrocities that they committed. But they said that this would be the first time we would do it. So, yes, there are, if people wanted to know, they would know. But it's a bit like the discussion we have today about Israel and Gaza. It's true that the Israeli media doesn't show even one photo of what goes on in Gaza. Quite incredible. All three television channels don't show even one still of the destruction in Gaza. And the Israeli newspapers, apart from Haaretz, follow this kind of coverage. And yet, my feeling is that even if they would be exposed to these scenes, it won't change their position, to my mind, unfortunately. The dehumanization is so deeply entrenched that there is no compassion, there's no basic compassion. And without that basic compassion, it's very difficult to create any understanding of the crime that is committed.
You see, this is what I've been wondering about, because there's dehumanization, but there's levels to dehumanization, and then there comes a point where it's gone too far that it's very hard to go back, right? Because my sort of feeling is that when we look at dehumanization of Palestinian lives in the West, it's distinctly different from Israel. And I think one of the key things that I think is different is often in the Western context, whether it's the US or wherever, I hear justifications being made for these attacks, whereas I'm not so sure whether in Israel, if you are sitting in Israel, let's say, talking to Israelis, a justification would be necessary, because there is a point where, and it happens in a lot of societies where mass killings become normal, especially against a group of people that you don't believe are human effectively. We have accounts like this from Germany and from elsewhere, where you can talk very matter-of-factly about killing people and you don't need to spout propaganda about it because it's just accepted that that's the done thing. And I sort of wonder whether that's still a distinction that exists between the two places, let's say.
I think yes. I think you're right. I think that you only have to hear the language that they're using. So there is now a daily account in the Israeli media. We have killed, proudly said, we've killed 35 terrorists. Today, Israel attacked the Jenin refugee camp. And we know that among the Palestinians killed was a boy on bicycles and a doctor on the way to hospitals. The Israeli report says we killed 10 Palestinian terrorists. And that's enough. It's in it. It's part of it. But by the way that people are being framed, and that works very well in Israel, in a way. And the amount of racism, I mean, the level of racism that goes along with it is something that developed over time. I don't think it was always there at this level. So, you know, racism is usually also fear. And some people try to convince me that the Israelis are afraid because they know they have done something wrong. And I say, I wish, because I think if that is true, there is a hope for reconciliation in the future, you know? We saw it in South Africa. If you think that they're afraid because they know they're doing something wrong, there's something to work on. Not immediately, but my fear is that they don't think that they're doing anything wrong. In fact, they have this righteous fury towards the world. And immediately they would accuse people of being anti-Semites if they point out, even friends of Israel, who would point out to atrocities that they found unacceptable, would immediately be defamed as anti-Semites. So there's a whole indoctrination here that goes through the educational system, the media, and so on, that assures, as you're right, I think you're right, this is unlike the other case you mentioned, that there's no need for justification. In fact, there's a great heroism in killing Palestinians. People are commended for that. And that is very, very inhuman. This is dehumanization at a very high level. Yeah.
So, what would you say is the state of play when it comes to Nakba denialism outside of Israel, in the West particularly? You know, does it follow very similar features and forms to what we see in Israel? Or was there something distinctly different about what we see happening there?
Well, I think until the 1980s, the Nakba denial was based on the same basis, if you want, as the Nakba denial in Israel. But since the 1980s, there's a change, and it started with books like Edward Said's Question of Palestine. Then the fact that people like me appeared as part of what used to be called the new historians, namely Israeli professional historians that found in the archives documentation that proved the Palestinian claims over the years of what happened in the Nakba. In brackets, one of the reasons we created this charity is that Israel reclassified all these documents. So we have put on our website these documents that probably nobody else would be able to see them because Israel will not allow. Closing brackets. The scholarly world has, maybe because of the Israeli historians, a few of the Israeli historians' willingness to corroborate Palestinian claims, maybe because of their own research and the development of something which is called Palestine Studies and so on. I think that academia has influence on educational system and so on, because I looked at textbooks and so on. It's a different story. Namely, in the civil society, and that's very different from Israel, in the civil society in the West, it's difficult to find people who deny the Nakba. There's a lot of people who do not know what really happened, but they're not buying into the Israeli narrative necessarily. However, in the discourse of the politicians, the people who still make the decision that have an impact on the reality on the ground, I think the denial is similar to the one in Israel. Less profound in the sense that people are not busy with it. Probably the best simple way to describe it, and I saw it when I looked at the lobbies on both sides, most politicians say it's a hot potato. Why should I deal with it? Immediately the Israelis would accuse me of being anti-Semite, so they try not to get too interested in this. Luckily for the Palestinians, I would say, I mean, I don't know if it's luck, but it's a fact. The United Nations General Assembly, the majority of the member states in the United Nations General Assembly are not from the West. And therefore, the Nakba is recognized in the United Nations General Assembly. But if you want to turn this successful fight against the denial into a policy that would change the reality today, you have to go through the Security Council. And the biggest deniers of the Nakba, Britain and France, are sitting there vetoing any action that emanates from the fact that the Nakba happened and continues.
So how does, let's say, Nakba denialism compare to denialism of other atrocities by other countries and other places and other times?
I think it has many similarities. There are genocides that are being denied. There are atrocities committed, like the genocide that Belgium committed in Congo, that only recently has been kind of aired, and so on. It differs in one way. First of all, it's legitimate to struggle against it in most places, politically as well as academically. It's not that easy politically to struggle against the denial in the West. That's one difference. And the most important difference is the denials we are talking about are closed chapters. Things happen, awful things happen, but they are over. This is a denial of something that still goes on. And that's a very important difference. It's important because some of the atrocities that were denied, by any kind of objective criteria, may be worse than what happened to the Palestinians in terms of number, the methods, and so on. But none of them is continuing, and that is it's like you're being a victim of a repeated crime that also is not acknowledged, and that's a very difficult thing for the Palestinians to bear and to live with.
It's interesting because also, as I'm sort of looking at all of this and what's happened, I mean, we've obviously noticed over the last few decades, public opinion in the West has been shifting quite a bit. And then obviously when October 7th happened, we did sort of feel like the atmosphere was more hostile in the public sphere. But then that shifted quite quickly again, away from being hostile towards, because you see it now that there's a massive wedge now that is on display for all to see between what public opinion and sentiment, especially among younger people, is towards Israel, and that a lot of Israeli messaging isn't really getting through, except to maybe some of the lawmakers. Of course, that's another matter. But towards the public, it's just not landing. Israeli propaganda has never been so bad at selling a war. What do you think is going on then? How do you feel Israel itself sees all of this, or does it not care that a lot of people don't believe them anymore?
Well, it's first of all, I agree. I think that Israeli propaganda is not working, especially the demand. Sorry, especially the demand that people would not talk about the context, as the Israelis would put it, and therefore they would only wish people to talk about what happened on the 7th of October. And people were not buying into it. And that really disappointed the Israelis. The second issue that is going on is the way the Israeli political system develops. And the kind of political forces that are taking over don't care that much of Israel's international standing. They somehow, either they have a great belief that God is on their side, or that they are facing a world which is anti-Semitic anyway, and luckily there are the allies, be it the Republicans and Trump, Urban, Moody. We'll get along. But this is not that important. What is important is that we are abiding by our own historical imperatives, ideological imperatives, and religious ones. So we have to see how it evolves, because it's obvious to me that if I'm right in analyzing the way Israeli politics is going, Israel will become more and more a pariah state. And there's quite a possibility that from actions of boycott and divestment by civil society, we will see the beginning of sanctions as well. That definitely is one possible scenario. In fact, probably from a Palestinian perspective, this is the light in the end of the tunnel. It's a long tunnel. It will take a long time to get there. It's not something from tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But there is a certain hopeful side to it in a very cruel way. Namely, the more brutal Israel is, the more likely this whole project of Zionism will come to an end, and the more likely the Palestinians will persuade more and more people about the just struggle.
So in that way, then, do you think of then the war on Gaza? Is it because obviously, typically Israel will frame its, whenever it does these sorts of things as an existential war because these Palestinians want to kill us and we must do this. But in a funny kind of way, is it Israeli action in Gaza right now that is causing the existential crisis for Israel's future?
Yes, in a way it does. It does. I mean, it's a cumulative. I don't think it's the only reason, but it definitely accelerated the process. We already saw it when important organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch framed Israel as an apartheid state. There was already an important landmark, I think. But I think that whatever the Hamas had in mind, and I'm not sure they succeeded in doing what they wanted, and I'm not sure I know exactly what they wanted. I won't go into that. The reaction they triggered, not their own action, but the reaction to their action, is going to be proved. It will prove to be a fundamental landmark that would change. I have a feeling would change not only the reality in Israel and Palestine, but also in the Arab world. If you remember, it was done in the midst of normalization efforts, talking about Saudi Arabia normalizing its relationship with Israel. It's a moment, a huge test also for the Arab world and the Muslim world, how to deal with Israel. How far can they remain flexible in justifying all kinds of actions? The Americans are trying to salvage it with a two-state solution, by extracting from the Israelis an agreement for a Palestinian state. I doubt it whether they will be able to do that, and I doubt it whether this would satisfy the forces within Palestine and in the Arab world and beyond who want to see a just solution in Palestine. We have too many years of the two states discourse to know that this is a charade and this is not a genuine solution.
So my last question now is about the future of the Nakba, and specifically the Nakba studies and its memory. What do you see as the future developments happening in regards to the study of the Nakba, but also because you've launched this charity, what is it you sort of see as being the future of our memory of it, the collective memory of it?
Yeah, I think there will be a struggle, and I hope to be active for many years in this struggle. One of the reasons I created in Exeter the Center for Palestine Studies was exactly for that. I'm trying just to give people, it's a very simple website address, so people, it's a Nakba MF in one word, Nakba MF with lowercases.org. So you can see one way of struggling against Nakba denial, which is, as I said, which will be very important, salvaging the documentation that Israel is hiding or destroying. It is not important for the Palestinians in the sense that they don't need Israeli documents to tell them what happened in the Nakba. But it's important for the world to have substantiation for the Palestinian claims through archival material. So I think that's one project is what we are doing. Another project is to insert the studies on the Nakba and even the ongoing Nakba within the right location in academia, which will influence the educational system. Today, still in many places, people teach, if at all they teach the Nakba, within the political science departments, international studies, as part of what they would call the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is, to me, a denial. I think it should be studied within colonial studies, anti-colonial studies, racist studies, even genocidal studies. And I think that would give it the right place, at least academically and scholarly, which I think will have influence on the educational system. A third realm of struggle is the media, the mainstream media. It's incredible to look at the alternative media or the social media. Nakba is recognized, acknowledged, discussed professionally, profoundly, in a very serious way. And social media did great things for making sure that the Nakba is not denied and not forgotten. But I don't see any reflection of this in the mainstream media. Now, people tell me, don't worry, because the mainstream media is not trusted anymore by many people as a credible source of information, which might be the case. And yet, for certain political elites, economic elites, it is still their source of information. So I think it's also important to reach there. And finally, would love to have, a new generation of politicians that understand the connection between those events, the present realities, and the future of Israel and Palestine and the Middle East as a whole. So my great hope is that of the many young people, for example, who marched in protests in the United States, some of them may be the future politicians who will make decisions. So we remain hopeful about this. But definitely, this is a crucial part of the discussion. We were misled for 50 years to talk about where does the border between Israel and the Palestinian Authority is, who has the right for security arrangement, what kind of economic arrangements. These are all tactical things that didn't bring us closer to reconciliation. Understanding that you have to acknowledge the Nakba, be accountable for it, and then ask the Palestinians to accept the Israelis is a very important way forward that has not been attempted officially by anyone who was involved in the so-called peace process.
Professor Ilan Pappe, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
Thank you, Usman. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you've missed this one and would like to catch up, or you would like to see some previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.